what we're doing here. If we read the inheritances in Joshua 19, what we find is that we read a tremendous number of cities and territories and areas, some of which are known and some of which we don't even know exactly where they are currently, archaeologically. So from the beginning I said to you, I think there's a more spiritually applicable way to do this, and that is to go back to two different areas. The first one being Genesis 49, and the second one being Deuteronomy 33, and to look at what Jacob prophesied about his own sons. Because a lot of the things that Jacob said in his prophecy at the end of his life about his sons was quite bizarre. You know, we already went through Judah, and of course that was a very long prophecy. You remember all the elements of it. It was very complex. We just went last week through Benjamin, and we found very interesting elements that are described that played out in history over time. So now we're in Joshua chapter 19, and we're going to cover verses 1 through 23. But it's broken into three parts. The inheritance of Simeon, which is verses 1 through 9. The inheritance of Zebulun, which is verses 10 through 16. And the inheritance of Issachar, which are verses 17 through 23. And we're going to go back each time into Genesis 49 and pick out the prophecy and then kind of tear it apart and look at how it applied to that tribe and to the people that came from that tribe. And eventually, you'll see, hopefully, how it applied and described in very different but very interesting ways the ministry of Christ. So let's start out with this son Simeon. So go to Genesis 29, and let's read about his birth. Remember, Jacob has a very complex and interesting family, to say the least. He has two wives, one of which he didn't really count on. Okay? He wanted Rachel, but he got a double package. He got snookered into also having Leah by his father-in-law Laban. And then over time, there's also two concubines too. So there's actually 4 women that end up producing the 12 sons of that become the tribe leaders of Israel.
Did he eat good then?
There's a lot of questions we could ask about that man that we probably don't exactly want to get into right now. But so look at Genesis 29 verses 31 through 34. 29 and 31 through 34. So starting in 31. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. Of course, that's by Jacob. Mm-hmm. She was not the favorite by any stretch. And he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. In other words, because I had a kid, certainly he's going to pay more attention to me.
That's a dumb idea.
It didn't work so well. Then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons now. Therefore his name is Levi. Now, turn now over about 20 chapters to Genesis 49. And let's read about this. Levi and Simeon get lumped together in their inheritance, interestingly enough. They're the only of the 12 that are together dealt with. They're lumped together as a group of 2. So we'll go to Genesis 49 starting in verse 5. So let's read it, and then let's kind of tear it apart. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel, and let not my glory be united with their assembly. because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now that should be perfectly clear to you. No? Okay. Well, then let's tear it down. Okay? So, Simeon and his brother Levi are linked in this prophecy because of a horrid event that they caused. Now, hold your place in Genesis 49, but go back to Genesis 34. I'm going to summarize what the action in Genesis 34 rather than reading the whole chapter to you. Basically, here's what happens. They have a little sister named Dinah. Okay? We think probably she's about 14 or 15 years old. She is seen by this man named Shechem. Shechem is very attracted to Dinah. So basically, Shechem molests her. Okay? Now, of course, she is very upset by this. The family is told. But even though she was treated in this way, Shechem falls in love with her and goes to Jacob, and also he goes to his own father and says, his father's name is Hamor, and says, allow me to marry her. So they have this discussion and they negotiate things, and it is allowed for her to marry Shechem. Now, the boys, Simeon and Levi, decide that they need to take things into their own hands a little bit here. They're not very happy about what Shechem did. So they devise a plan. They say to the people of this area, Hamor's area, this tribal area, we'll agree to let you intermarry, but you must agree to our tradition. And our tradition, of course, is circumcision. Therefore, you must be circumcised before we can allow this marriage to go forth. So Shechem and Hamor say, okay, that's reasonable. So all the men in the entire town get circumcised. Okay? On the third day, when they are the most incapacitated, okay, Levi and his brother Simeon each take swords and go about and kill all of the men in the village. They wipe them out. Now, interestingly, the word sword in Greek is makera, and it literally means a butcher's knife. In the Hebrew, the word is maker, M-A-C-H-E-R, and it means counsel or agreement. So what we're seeing here is a play on words. Do you see it? Go back now to 49th chapter of Genesis. Simeon, verse 5-6. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their maker, their swords, are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. The Hebrew, maker. Okay? So it's really a play on words here. Their agreement or counsel is of violence, although the people don't understand that's what their counsel is really all about when they make this agreement for marriage, okay? So this is what is being said here. So we see in verse 6, after this revenge occurs, and they kill all these men, this hidden agreement, quote unquote, we see that Jacob condemns their actions and he demotes them, okay? He says in verse 6, let my soul not enter into their counsel, in other words, their evil plan. And he says, and let not my glory be united with their assembly, what they did together, because they slew in anger, they slew men, and in self-will, they, of course, lamed oxen. Apparently they cut the tendons of the oxen so that they couldn't be used either. And then he says in verse 7, cursed is their anger, for it's fierce, and their wrath, for it's cruel. And then he says, I'll disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So we see here, go back if you would. You have to go back to Joshua now. Hold your hand in Genesis 49, but go to Joshua 19. And a verse there will make a lot more sense to you when you look at it. Go back to Joshua 19. And we're going to look at verse 9. Let's read it. The inheritance of the sons of Simeon was taken from the portion of the sons of Judah. For the share of the sons of Judah was too large for them, so the sons of Simeon received an inheritance in the midst of Judah's inheritance. Okay? Look at the map. Look. Okay? Look where Simeon is. Right in the middle of Judah. Okay? Who goes first in the inheritance? Who goes first? Who went first? I'm sorry?
I was going to say the oldest son.
No. Actually, the fourth oldest son went first. Remember? Judah. He got his inheritance first, even though he was fourth.
I didn't understand what you were asking.
The reason why is because Reuben, okay, we didn't go into Reuben, but he got part of his inheritance over here, first of all, and he made some mistakes also, all right? We didn't go into that one, but he made his mistakes. So he got his inheritance over here, not in the main area, all right? Then, of course, these two guys, the next two in line, Levi and Simeon, because of what they did, they're in the penalty box. And so the first person, if you remember, several weeks ago, we went into the tribe of Judah because Judah got their inheritance first, all according to the prophecy.
But that's in this situation. Typically, it's what she said, right? I mean, to start with.
Typically, you'd have the oldest going first, right?
Okay.
But of course, and of course, the prophecy is very interesting because remember another element of it: the second youngest son, Joseph, okay, ends up with a double portion because of this unusual event which occurs, where in Genesis 48, Joseph brings his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, before Jacob at the end of his life. And what does Jacob do when he presents them? He says, first, I'm going to adopt those boys for myself. And then he switches his hands and puts his right hand on the youngest and his left hand on the oldest of them. And he says, they're mine. Therefore, we now have in Israel not a tribe of Joseph, but rather we also have a tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim. And that makes the 12.
Technically, the oldest mistakes, right?
Just about. Judah made some mistakes too, although he kind of made up for them a little bit, and that's probably why he ended up getting his inheritance first. But
And again, one of two of those that you just said, Levi, he became the tribe priest.
right. But of course, Levi had some problems too. Okay. Okay, Aaron was the leader of the Levitical tribe, and what did he do as they were about ready to enter the land where they were wandering?
The calf.
Yeah, the golden calf. He decides it'd be a great idea to make an idol while Moses is up on top of Mount Sinai, okay? And of course, Moses comes down and is absolutely furious at what he did. And of course, they go into the penalty box because of that, but they end up redeeming themselves somewhat, and that's why they don't get a territory, but we'll take it here in 2 weeks, but they get a set of cities. They get 48 cities all around the country, the Levitical cities. Plus they get the priesthood. Plus they get a tithe from the others. So God makes it up to them in a different way, even though they don't get a technical territory. All right? Okay. Now, let's go on and let's look at the inheritance of Zebulun. So we're going to cover verses 10 through 16 in Joshua 19. But we're not going to read those because, again, we'll just talk about a whole bunch of cities that really I don't think is really the point. So let's look at his beginnings. Let's look at Zebulun's beginnings. So turn back to Genesis 30. Genesis 30.
These tribes, they just didn't want to follow, or they had their own ideas, or They didn't want to follow the Lord. What was their problem?
There are a lot of problems. Okay.
No different than there is today.
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly the nature of human frailty is universal through history. So now, going to Zebulun in Genesis 30, and we're going to look at verses 19 and 20. We're going to see the birth of this young man. And Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me. She's a little preoccupied about this, isn't she? Okay?
Because she was not see.
Yeah, because she wasn't.
She was ugly sister.
She's the ugly, not ugly stepsister, but she was the ugly sister. That is true. And look at what finally it says. So she named him Zebulun. So that's how Zebulun comes into the world. So we see he's actually technically the 10th son of Jacob. And he's younger than his next oldest brother, born to Leah, which we'll take next, Issachar. So Issachar is actually older than Zebulun, but interestingly enough, he's getting inheritance before his brother. So let's go through it and see why that may be true. His name means, of course, glorious dwelling place, which is both a literal sense in terms of Leah's desire for her husband to dwell with her more, okay? And it's also a prophetic aspect, too. And we'll look at some of the prophetic elements here. Now, when you read Genesis 49, so let's read go back to Genesis 49 now, and let's read what Jacob says about him. Genesis 49, starting in verse 13. Yeah, it is really just verse 13. And it says some interesting things about Zebulun. Jacob says prophetically. He says, Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank, that is, flank means, okay, the kind of back area or backside area, the flank, all right, says his flank shall be toward Sidon. Now, there's another, so basically it implies that this territory of Zebulun would touch on two seas. That is, the Mediterranean on the west and the Sea of Galilee on the east. All right? But if you look at the map here, okay,
In the middle.
of our friend's pointer, Zebulun here, it doesn't really quite seem to make it. In other words, he's definitely over near the Sea of Galilee. But he doesn't really make it over to the Mediterranean because Asher is actually on the coast there. So you say, no, how could that be? What's that all about? So I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy 33, and I'm going to read you something. Because remember, Deuteronomy 33 are companion prophecies. Just like Genesis 49 are prophecies about these tribes, Deuteronomy 33 are also prophecies about these tribes, but there's some elements that are different. They're not identical. Yes.
Who is Asher?
He's one who is coming later, another son. We'll take him next week.
Is he included in those 12 sons?
Yes, absolutely. He gets his inheritance after Issachar does. Okay, so what I'm going to read here is I'm going to read in Deuteronomy 33, 18 and 19. It gives us some additional information about Zebulun.
I'm sorry, what verse is it?
Deuteronomy 33, 18 and 19.
Okay.
Now here's some of the additional information. Prophetically it's given. And of Zebulun, he said, rejoice, Zebulun, in your going forth, and Issachar also in your tents. They shall call peoples to the mountain, There they shall offer righteous sacrifices, for they shall draw out of the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasure of the sand. So it's telling us here that apparently what happens is that Zebulun gets access to the Mediterranean to do commercial fishing and other commercial work. That's part of why he goes before his brother Issachar. He has access to that territory, though it doesn't sit quite on the Mediterranean. And of course, let's see. Also, I want to mention that the territory that Zebulun gets, so you'll see it up there again, is agriculturally an extremely rich territory. So it talks about that there's benefit of the soil or sand, and there's also benefit because he gets access also to maritime work.
Is the Megiddo, is this on his territory?
I am not quite certain. You have to look and see if it is. Yeah, no, Megiddo is in Manasseh's territory. You see Megiddo? Megiddo is right there in Manasseh's territory.
But it's only a matter of a few miles, though.
It is, but the interesting thing is the way that the inheritance is given, because the younger of them is given the inheritance before the older of them. It's because he's letting the younger have opportunity to the territory of the older. And that's why it's staged that way. Okay? Now look back at, if you're still in, I got to turn back to Genesis 49. Notice in verse 13.
Well, is there anything like, do they have like legal stuff, or does that just says, okay, you don't get nothing, you get this, this is your
These are the deeds and the.
But I mean, there's actual legal documents.
No, I mean it's the word it's all written down here, you know, and it's then of course the elements of it are described prophetically in Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33, and then of course where we are in Joshua is the literal order in which they're going to get the things. Okay, that's why you get the first four get them. We know that Levi doesn't get territory itself; they only get the Levitical cities, and of course then it starts the process of the others getting theirs.
Well, I mean, I know we know it happened because it's in here, but I meant at the time, like, could that son go like his dad dies and he's like, oh no, I was supposed to get that. I mean, or do they have actual documents between them?
I think the document they had is what simply was written here by the Holy Spirit from the mouth of Jacob. And that's what they followed.
What about the survey point that we had discussed earlier? It would make sense why she asked that question, I think, for the same thing.
Yeah,
It doesn't say it right in here. It implies.
It implies, yes.
But theoretically, given what Anna said and looking at the map, in order to define the territories, and yet we're talking about whether they're growing something or in the midst of we're going to have a fight over this or hand it down to another person. There's someplace there's got to be a record, I would think.
Well, the thing is, it's like you said, Genesis 49, Deuteronomy 33 say this is what's going to be. But not only in the literal sense, but in the prophetic sense too. And we've been going back and forth and showing the typologies of Christ in this, right? Then, of course, where we are in Joshua is the order in which the process in which they get these territories. But like we said last week, it's interesting how the last 7 have to go out and actually survey. But then God, through the lot, tells them, but this is what you'll get. Okay? So, now go back to Genesis 49. I want you to look at verse 13 again. says, Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore and shall be a haven for ships. A haven for ships. In the Hebrew, it means literally, and he to a shore of ships. If you said it grammatically, that's what it would say. In other words, what he's saying here is that it connects, when it talks about Sidon, see the reference of Sidon? It connects the northern part of the territory of Zebulun to what we could call the metroplex of Sidon. Sidon, if you remember, is up north. It's not on this map, actually, is it? It's up north in what is, of course, Lebanon today. You have Tyre and Sidon. They were, of course, the capital cities of the Phoenician Empire. And the Phoenician Empire was an empire of commercial naval trading. Literally, we have archaeological evidence that they went all over the world. Matter of fact, yeah. When we were, and I've told this story before, when we went to New Hampshire, and I'm sorry, it was, it was New Hampshire.
We're talking about Stonehenge?
Yeah, the Stonehenge of America. Yeah. Salem. Salem, Mass. No, Salem.
Salem, New Hampshire.
Okay. At any rate, when we went and we talked about it last year, okay, when I was talking to the archaeologist there at the Stonehenge of America, I was asking him what's the evidence of this land, and he said, well, where you are now, even though Boston is 30 miles from here, he said the archaeological evidence when we've been digging is the shoreline was probably 2,000, 3,000 years ago was probably within 4 miles of this place. And he said there's another interesting thing that we found here, because this place they have archaeologists come all the time and do digs. I mean, every year, multiple groups, colleges, universities. And he said the other thing that's very interesting, he says, we found a gold coin within a couple miles of this site. He said, you want to know what it was? I said, yeah, I'd really like to know. He said it was a Phoenician gold coin.
That's very interesting.
Phoenician. Now think about how far they traveled to get there. So if you think Christopher Columbus was the one that first saw America, I'm sorry, folks, but he didn't. It was probably the Phoenicians.
Maybe someone just brought it from the trip.
Why they were sightseeing?
But yeah, that's right. But they were sightseeing.
In other words, they salted the earth.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
More or less ahead of time.
But
put the gold out there.
But if you study the Phoenician Empire, it stretches, its naval commercial elements were literally all over this planet. It's unbelievable how they traveled in their boats and their ships.
Can I ask you a question on that point?
Yes.
Did they have a sextant?
I'm not certain what they used. I don't think a sextant technically was invented then, but they might have had a more primitive version of it.
You understand?
I know. Because when you're out in the middle of the ocean,
and that's all you see.
You need to navigate by the stars. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
They didn't have some.
They had, we had,
GPS.
not GPS. Okay. Now, so like I said, Sidon is mentioned in this prophecy. Remember, as I said, Sidon is one of the capitals of the Phoenician Empire. And of course, the word Sidon, interestingly enough, in its original language means the catching of fish. That's what Sidon means. Now, I want you to turn, keep your place in Genesis 49, but I want you to turn all the way over to the Gospel of Matthew.
Oh, okay. You ain't kidding about all the way over.
All the way over. I want you to go to Matthew chapter 4.
It's nice to have big hands here.
Yeah. And we're going to look at verse 19.
Matthew what?
Chapter 4.
Four.
So, now, Jesus was on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Western side of the Sea of Galilee. All right? And it says, verse 8, I'm going to read 18 and 19. And walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. All right? Verse 19, and he said to them, follow me, for I will make you fishers of men. Guess what territory these guys were in?
Lebanon.
Zebulun. They were men of Zebulun. That's where they came from. And they're made fishers of men. Interesting prophetic element implied there, isn't it?
So how does that pertain? Because if you're clear up where Lebanon is today, they had to travel through other people's land.
They did.
And okay, so did we have a friendly manifest that allowed them to travel, or?
They did. They did because, again, they knew this prophecy. They knew
When
that
you say they, who are we referring
the
to?
Jews, the Jews that lived in the territories, they knew their territory. They knew the word. They had the scriptures. I mean, they had the scrolls. All right. I mean,
So they were passed around.
right. Moses wrote them all down. It says in many, many, many places.
You're not talking about Washington Post, right?
No. But he wrote, it was all written down and it was copied by the scribes. So it was spread out. And it was in their synagogues. They all had a copy of the Old Testament in their synagogues. So, and of course, the Torah was read so many verses each week until they got in the whole year through the whole Torah. So they read it over and over and over again. So they knew these things. They knew what God was directing them to do. They knew that Zebulun was allowed to pass through and have this connection to Sidon.
So today, why are we having such an aspects of the Jewish religion? I mean, if this is written down time and time again and it's passed on, these ducks didn't learn how to read, or what's the issue here?
I'm not certain what you're saying. What's the
current Jewish population?
Well, the current Jewish population is agnostic or atheist.
Which is what I was saying.
Right.
To pronounce the word and I didn't do it.
Exactly.
But the point is, okay, if it happened here, are they today denying God's word? What are they doing?
Today they're not reading God's word, except for the conservative elements.
Isn't that denying?
In reality, they're taking
They're making their own way to go.
They're taking
Not
up.
denying, it's ignoring, actually.
That could be it.
Ignoring.
See, it's almost like the fact that every child that's Jewish, generally, goes to several years of Hebrew school. That's a huge tradition in Jewish parents. And they teach them all these stories in Hebrew school. But how many of those people are serious students of even of the Torah? Very few are. So they're Jewish by almost a heritage concept, rather than Jewish in the sense that they genuinely get into the Word and read the prophets and read the Torah.
Kind of like I've got to say, like our culture, mom went to church and grandma went to church.
They were Methodists.
Yeah.
We're Methodists.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're always going to be, but yet they have no idea.
Really what it means.
Right.
Exactly.
So how do they decipher today, given the map, how do they decipher and understand what's going on with Palestine?
They don't really.
So they're going to be conscripted into the Israeli military, having no clue what they're defending and why.
Most of them will not even know what tribal group they're from.
That's scary.
They could find it out, but there's a lot of them that they're just not interested.
Well, you got a real problem. They got nukes over there.
I know. This is why when we studied the prophet Zechariah, remember when we got to the 14th, 12th, and 14th chapters, what happens? The unbelieving Jews, because of the invasion that occurs in Israel, in Jerusalem, they're pushed to the wall, and then the unbelieving remnant cries out for Messiah, and he delivers them, and that's when they become believers. Only at the very end, the majority.
Some of them miss the boat or what?
Some of them will miss the boat, but a lot of them will know their Messiah, but only at the very end.
Remember, I printed out the end of
chronological order.
That talks about that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets confusing.
Well, looking at what he's teaching, I try and compare it coming from history, for what you're doing to real life today. History predicts tomorrow. Always has.
It tends to repeat itself.
Yeah, over and over and over.
Yeah.
Over and over and over.
But one of the things that's interesting about Jews that most of them don't understand, the very conservative ones do, is that God says that when they finally go back to their land, after 2,000 years of being dispersed all over the planet, that once that happens, they'll never leave. That's the promise. So what happened, we're going to have the 70th celebration of it on May 14th, okay? What it says is whatever happens in that area, as volatile it is, no one is going to oust them there prior to Messiah coming back to the earth. That's the promise. It's interesting. So we're going to have to watch the geopolitical event. Let's go on, if you would, and let's finish off. We're going to Issachar now. And that's covered, of course, in verses 17 through 23 of chapter 19 of Joshua. So let's go back to his origins now. Go back to Genesis chapter 30. And let's see where this guy came from. And we're going to look at verses 17 and 18. Back to Leah again. And God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. So she named him Issachar. Now, so we see Issachar is actually technically the ninth son of Jacob. Okay? The ninth son, but the fifth one born to Leah. Ninth son, you got that?
Put it there.
He's in the ninth order, but he's the fifth of Leah's sons.
We have a chart here.
Okay?
Crazy family.
Crazy family.
Did the girls get nothing?
There were sisters too, but of course the inheritance came through the boys. So that's why they're dealt with primarily here. So you can see how that works. Now, his name, Issachar, means he is wages. And of course, Leah asked for another child, and she got what she asked for, so she got the wage of her request. That's part of why she named him what she named him. He is given his inheritance behind his younger brother, Zebulun, if you notice, but who is allowed, as we've talked about, access to his area. Despite that, Issachar receives a very rich territory. And you see, well, we don't have it up right now. You want to go back to the map, see his territory is right here. Okay? It's a very rich agricultural territory. Now, some very interesting things are said about Issachar in Genesis 49. So let's turn to Genesis 49 from Genesis 30 and read what's prophetically said about Issachar. Verse 14. Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between the sheepfolds. When he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulders to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. That should be clear to you, right? All right, let's tear it apart. Now, a strong donkey literally in the Hebrew means an ass of bone. In other words, he's got a good skeleton. You know, as you look at horses, that one's got a good structure.
Right.
Well, that's what they're saying about Issachar. This guy is solid, okay? All right.
He can play tackle.
That's right. Now, it implies the future of this tribe who inherit here a very fertile area, a very agricultural area, and in the history of this tribe, they proved to be steady, reliable, hard agricultural workers and very productive. Now, it states that he's lying between two sheepfolds. which is an interesting statement. This seems to refer both to the position of his territory in between Manasseh and Naphtali and Zebulun, kind of protected in the middle,
Tell me again. Oh, where's in my head
he's
there.
right here.
Oh,
So he's kind of tucked in between Manasseh, Zebulun, and the end of and southern end of Naphtali. So he's kind of in the sheepfold that way. That's one thing that means. But also, so it implies, of course, his security or comfort of his placement. But there's another thing that it seems to mean too. So I want you now, from Genesis, to turn to the book of Judges. And we're going
that way.
to chapter 5 in Judges. So I'm going to have you learn the Old Testament here.
Mm-hmm.
We're all over it.
Sorry, what does it mean, wage?
Wage means payment. What your payment is, your wage, correct. All right, so Judges chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 15 and 16. I hope I have this right here. Yes. Starting at 15, and the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Now you know who Deborah was. She was a judge of Israel. Okay? After Joshua died, there were no more clearly appointed leaders in Israel. So we go through this time called the time of the judges, where there are temporarily appointed people that kind of come forward and lead the nation for a period of time. They're called the judges. So Deborah is one of these. This is who it's talking about here.
Can I ask you?
How they happen to have a woman?
Exactly. That was my question.
Because it appears, when you look at the story of Deborah, that no one else stood up to the plate when Israel was needing a lot of help. They're being, constantly warred against by all these tribes that they didn't take care of under Joshua. They were constantly being harassed, and so no man apparently stood up to the plate, and Deborah did. So she was appointed judge.
So this is like Weinstein and his appointment of Superwoman,
Appointment of Superwoman. Yeah,
Yeah.
Deborah ends up, yes, being Superwoman. She does.
considering he's Jewish.
That's true. He is Jewish.
Mhm.
Okay, so we see. So let's go on here. So verse 14, or is it 14? Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't finished.
Yeah, Bishop 15. Yeah.
Okay.
We got
So the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, as was Issachar, so was Barak. Barak was another judge. They were referring there to another judge, okay?
Barack Obama?
Not exactly.
Atta girl, right there. with
So
you.
into the valley they rushed at his heels, and among the divisions of Reuben. They were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds? Okay, they're talking about Issachar. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks among the divisions of Reuben? They were great searchings of heart. And then he goes on and talks about Gilead and the tribe of Dan here. But what we see in this is that it's a reference to Issachar being content in their role and in their placement again. Now, it says also in Genesis 49, going back to Genesis 49,
Are we sure we're studying Joshua?
not quite,
Oh,
not quite. We're studying this in a different way.
49.
Back to Genesis 49 now. And we're going to look at, you see, see which verse is it? Where it talks about lying between two sheepfolds.
Oh,
14.
And 14, okay. Strong donkey lying between the sheepfolds. Now, this seems to refer both to, like I said, his position and placement, but I'm sorry, I was going on to when we saw,
Road, no. Wait.
when he saw that a resting place was good. That's what I wanted to take.
Yeah, I have a question. What does it mean, sheepfold?
Sheepfolds mean the herd of sheep.
Yeah.
A group of them.
Yeah, because in Russian, it is like in between two levers.
No. It's talking about a group of sheep. Is what it's talking about there. Now,
think it'd be interesting to ask on it how the Russian deciphers rivers versus what Tim's
Well,
talking
not
about.
rivers exactly, it was like streams of water. I don't see any connection.
I don't either when you say
Yeah.
that.
No.
I'm not
What do you think,
certain.
Tim?
Yeah, I'm not certain why they interpret it that way. It's pretty clearly sheepfolds,
And
in
sheepfolds
Hebrew.
are the pastures?
The pastures of sheep. So it says in verse 15, when he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. Okay? Now,
Pleasant's a good word instead
Yeah.
of pleasant.
in this verse, the word resting is the word manukaha. This is the Hebrew, which is the same word we find in Psalm 23, verse 2, where it talks about the still waters. It literally means the resting waters, the still waters. Same word is used in Hebrew there.
Is
It's-
that possibly why the Russian part, water
Maybe.
and rivers?
Maybe their interpreters looked at it that way.
Those Russians, who knows?
But it also, the same word is found in another interesting passage. So now, I want you to turn to the book of Isaiah. Book of Isaiah, and we're going to go to the 11th chapter.
It's not in your outline, honey, right?
Yes, it is. Isaiah 11, verse 10.
Okay, it's D.
I think I got the right one here. Hopefully I got the right one. Yes, it says, then, starting verse 10, it says, then it will come about in that day, it's talking about the day of Messiah, that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, the Messiah, who will stand as a signal, literally an emblem or a sign, for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. Same word again, his resting place. So again, the same word is used here to describe Messiah, as is used in this passage in Genesis 49. Now, it's interesting also that the verses about he is a strong animal. Let's go back to Genesis 49 again. I know. Back to Genesis 49. It's the last part of it. It says in verse 15, Genesis 49, he bowed his shoulders to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. You say, well, what could that possibly mean? Well, the idea here is that that Issachar is this strong donkey or this servant animal who is content with their role. Remember, it talks about his contentment or his placement was, and enjoys the sheepfolds, which of course are all elements, interestingly enough, that describe the ministry of Jesus. Why? What did Jesus say about, I am, I take care of my Father's sheep. Okay? What does he do? He is the servant that comes to pay the price for sin. He takes his role that is given to him by his Father and bears the burden of the cross. All images of what Jesus will end up doing are images found here in the 49th chapter of Genesis.
But didn't it say that Issachar?
It's about Issachar.
Right. Then he says he bowed his shoulders to bear burdens,
That's right.
and because became a slave of forced
Right.
labor.
Yeah, let me show you how this applies prophetically further to Christ. Turn to Matthew 11. Matthew 11.
I'll tell you what, you're working the Bible
Yeah.
tonight.
Yeah.
Matthew 11, and we're going to read verses 28 and 30. Now think about what was just said about he's a servant and he bows his shoulder to take on a burden, okay? And it's Matthew 11, starting verse 28. Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light. In other words, what's the point? He bears our burdens, right? He bears our burdens. It's a prophetic image about the ministry of Jesus which would occur.
Can you answer the question in Greek?
I'm sorry?
Can you answer the question and the definition in Greek, the term yoke?
I'd have to look it up.
The reason I'm asking, yoke can be used in a multitude of issues. One of it is harness.
Yeah, it usually was the wooden system of two animals, oxen or whatever, okay, that would be then linked together to pull the plow or other things. That was the usual Old Testament yoke. So I'm going to read one other thing to you to show you the prophetic elements here.
Okay, just a second, question again.
Okay?
How does, I guess I'm not getting it. Issachar,
Yes.
how does it be connected to Messiah?
Because it says of him that he will take his role, he'll accept his role, he'll accept his placement, that is what's appointed to him. It says that he will become a servant animal, quote unquote, a servant entity, that he'll bear the burden and he will take care of the sheepfolds. All of those are part of the images of Christ. Okay? The great shepherd
So
who
why-
takes care of
why
the sheep.
his brother in Christ?
Because that's the way the Lord set it up. It just so happens that he is a prophetic fulfillment of someone.
Messiah did not come from this Christ.
He did not. But prophetically, images of what Messiah would do are in this tribe's description.
Okay, is it also in each tribe?
A lot of them. Judah, remember we went through Judah, how many prophetic elements are? He reigned.
Yes, for Joseph.
Right. Yeah. Not all of them have these prophetic elements, but Issachar is one that does.
Okay.
I want to read you also, thinking about these elements here, I want to read you Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. You don't have to, I'll just read it to you. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy or contentment, just like Issachar was content in his place, set before him, endured or bore the cross, despising shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The elements are also there, as we see the writer of Hebrews talking about this. Notice also another thing. In John chapter 10, and you don't have to turn there, I'll read it for you. In John chapter 10, verses 14 through 16, this famous passage, think about what was said about Issachar. I'm the good shepherd. Remember the two sheepfolds? I'm the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life, I'm a burden bearer, for the sheep. Now notice verse 16. Listen carefully to verse 16, because a lot of people don't get what Jesus says here. And I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I must bring them also, and they shall hear my voice, and they shall become one flock with one shepherd. Notice he talks about the two parts of the sheepfold. What does Jesus say here? As the good shepherd, he is bringing together two parts of sheep called the Jews and the Gentiles. And it's a fulfillment prophetically of what's said about the sheepfold here, right in Genesis 49:14. In Philippians chapter 3, it's kind of we can turn to, you don't have to turn to, I'll read it for you. It's kind of a summation in a sense of what we're talking about.
That's chapter 2, honey.
Yeah, 2, 5 through 8. So I'm going to read Philippians 2, 5 through 8. And I think this is important in these images of Messiah, because here's the application to our lives also, okay? As what Christ has done, we're also to do. Have this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Think how often we have a problem lowering ourselves and taking a position of humility. It's very difficult for us to do. We want to be first. We want to be respected. We want to be recognized. It's hard for us to humble ourselves.
Are you talking about politics today?
I'm talking about human nature. Verse 7, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bond servant. Remember, back in Genesis 49, at the end of Issachar, it says, and he became a forced servant. Christ became the forced servant. And he says, he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. He looked like one of the sheep himself, right? And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. Think about the burden he bared physically on his own shoulders in that respect. And then, of course, we see that the result, therefore God also highly exalted him. So Issachar is a very interesting image in many respects of prophetically what would happen with Messiah thousands of years later. So,
Oh, interesting.
yes, they're all very prophetic.
Yeah.
And as you wind them through, you see many different fulfillments of them. You see fulfillments of them in the book of Judges. You see fulfillments of them sometimes in the prophets later. And eventually in the New Testament, you see fulfillments in the ministry and the work of Jesus himself. So, I think I've given you enough to chew on tonight.
Seriously?
Now, next week,
I feel like I've been out of this.
Next week, we're going to finish chapter 19 by taking 3 more of these guys and look at their tribes and what's said about them and where they're placed. And we're going to talk especially about the tribe of Dan, because Dan has the most bizarre inheritance and the most bizarre activity, and what is said about Dan is very enigmatic, and yet it's very interesting to follow it. And we'll take it through many, many different verses and show you how prophetically fulfills what Dan does.
We also need to say about multiple.
We will. Yeah.
We'll need to say about it.
Okay. Well, let's do this first. Yeah, let's do this first. Let's go ahead and, Michael, would you pray to close us tonight? I will.